This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Welcome to the XCast X-Files Podwatch. This is episode number 100, and we're going to be covering episodes Scary Monsters and Jump the Shark today. I'm your host, Russ Hugo, and with me is Lauren Forey. Hi, Lauren.
Hey, Russ.
I hope you survived episode 99 okay.
I did. I got through it. I'm recovered. I'm ready to go.
Okay, yeah. I think it's a couple of cups of tea for me until I got my nerves calmed and we're ready to go. Okay, so the first episode we're going to be talking about is Scary Monsters, and that is episode number 14 of season 9. It was written by Thomas Schnoz and directed by Dwight Little.
Hey, so Scary Monsters is another one of the creepy kid episodes that I seem to find myself talking about a lot. It's set in Fairhope, Pennsylvania, which is a real town, or at least a real township. I looked it up. I'm in Pennsylvania, but this one's closer out to Pittsburgh, out in the woods and the mountains. And it features Agent Layla Harrison, who was the Mulder-obsessed agent that appeared in Season 8, Episode 19, the episode Alone. And basically, Agent Harrison comes to Scully saying there's this mysterious death of the mother of a child whose grandmother works for the FBI and does something with the carpool. But anyway, this woman seemed to have stabbed herself to death 16 times. And Agent Harrison really wants to get Scully's help. She thinks it's an X-File. Scully turns her down. She goes to Reyes and Doggett and kind of tricks them by omission to get them to drive out there to this place. And it seems really weird that there's this father. The father is keeping the son isolated up in basically this cabin up in the mountains with no phone, so no one can reach them. And at night, he tends to the kid thinks he's seeing these monsters on the bed, and instead of helping his son, he's keeping the door closed, so his son's trapped in there with the monsters. When Doggett and Reyes and Harrison are up at this mountain cabin, they realize that there is something supernatural and weird going on, and they decide to stay. And in fact, they can't leave when they want to because something happens with their car engine exploding with blood coming out of it. Meantime, Scully is back at home dissecting cats on her kitchen table as a way to try to figure out what this monster is. And it turns out that all these monsters are from the boy's own imagination. And the boy's a bit of a psychopath, and he makes people see what he draws. Things seem like everybody's in danger. Reyes thinks she's got this thing in her stomach. Harrison's eyes are bleeding. Doggett gets thrown into a pit with all these giant pincer monsters. And then thanks to Doggett, who realizes that it's part of this kid's ability to project his imagination, he is able to convince the boy that he set the house on fire, and it causes the boy to pass out, stops all the terrible hallucinations that were happening, and then they are able to take the boy to, as is often with an X-Files episode, to a psychiatric institute where they numb his mind with television so that he can't create any more monsters.
Great parenting skills. Thank you for the summary. Oh boy, I do have to make I would like to. Do is a strong word, but I'd like to make a small personal announcement that I was a lapsed X-Files fan for quite a while. I started off watching the series when it first aired started with Deep Throat, and then watched on and dropped off around season 4. So I dipped back in season 9 to this episode. I just was flipping channels, and I saw the scene where Doggett shoots one of the little creatures, and then it splits in half and then runs under the wall. And that gave me a very, very bad impression of late-stage X-Files. And so I always I'm never going to revisit it. But when I did and went back and I realized, oh, wow, I actually really liked Doggett, and, and Reyes too, but I really liked some of the things that they were trying to do. But I blame this episode for giving me I blame that scene. Let's not be unfair to the episode. For giving me a bad prejudice that kept me away from later X-Files for almost 10 years.
It's the CGI, isn't it? It's so bad. I mean, it is early stages where they could use it in TV more cheaply. And you can tell Whereas in like maybe an early season episode when CGI or those special effects would have been more expensive, they would have tried to create some actual bugs or something. It's just clearly all computer, and they do make you roll your eyes.
And I normally don't mind bad CGI sometimes if the story can go, but there are some other elements, and I'll jump right to it and get your opinion, and I'll give mine away right out of the gate, is the kid, no offense, I mean, better actor than I could ever be, no argument, but really grated on my nerves, and being included in the scene and the rest, I was, okay, I was going there. So what do you think about the kid and the character and the actor?
I mean, I thought the character in this case was a little too inconsistent. Like, at first, this kid seems terrified about what's happening. He's so scared. Like, that's why he's screaming for his dad in the cold open. Like, he really thinks these monsters are going to kill him and get him. And then, like, by the end of the episode, it's like, yeah, he knows he's creating these monsters. He wants these people to die. He doesn't care. He's not scared of them at all. So it didn't really fit. There was no cause for his character to change in that way. And I think if they would have kept it so that the boy was scared of something real that
the boy didn't know he was doing it.
Yeah.
That kind of a thing. It would have been so easy to make that change.
And he seemed to know that he was doing it. I mean, he drew these pictures and knew that this was happening to these people because he wanted the monsters to get him. So that part didn't work for me. Like, stick with either the kid is totally evil and he enjoys what he's doing, or keep him really scared and he doesn't know what's going on. But switching between the two just didn't cut it.
And I think the director must have told him to play it as if you're someone evil, because he's always kind of has this overly annoying, trying to be angelic edge, and then becomes Village of the Damned. But you totally hit the nail on the head there at the beginning. If the dad's keeping him locked out, why does he want the dad to come in if he's willfully drawing the creatures, unless he wants his dad to die like his mom died? But then the door shouldn't matter because he's able to project his special psychic powers to the car and wherever else. The door is not a barrier, so it shouldn't matter. His dad holding the door doesn't affect anything.
No, and the dad said often, he's doing this because he's scared. And I thought, okay, there's a chance to go into some family tragedy backstory. What is this kid scared of? Was it an abusive father? Was the mother abusing him? Which is rare, but would be an interesting twist, and that's why he caused the mother to kill herself. Like, give me a reason why this kid is so scared of stuff to, like, build up his character, and it doesn't do that. Like you said, and then he's able to use these psychic projections or whatever, and sometimes he can, and then sometimes they don't seem to matter, and it's really inconsistent.
Yeah, and normally you don't have to have an explanation of where the powers came from. But in this instance, there's not even any information about when they started or why. It's just kind of vague, like, oh, they started, the mom died, and he moved. But it's like, okay. Has he had his whole life, or he just eventually became a psychopath? Has he been a psychopath his whole life? I don't know.
And maybe take away the crayons. That's what I kept thinking. Like, if he's able to project these things because he can draw, take away the crayons and the paper, and then he can't draw anything, and none of this stuff could happen.
And how has the father not noticed that before? I don't know. That he's drawing stuff and that's coming true, if it's that obvious. But okay, considering he's drawing all the time. C'est la vie. Crazy kids. What do you think about Layla Harrison as a character and coming back to the episode?
I thought it was a really nice way to bring her back. I mean, on one hand, and I think that she's a character that I think is trying to force the idea on the audience, because she says a lot, well, Doggett, I'm always comparing you to Mulder, but you know what, Doggett, you handled this just as well as Mulder could, or even better. And to me, that's such a statement of like, look, audience, the show can be successful without David Duchovny, see? And those lines hit the nail a little too hard on the head for me.
I did write down the quote at the end. The guy who liked her said, so this is where the magic happened, huh? Or maybe it was her. I think it was Layla who said this. Magic happened, huh? And then I think it's Scully who says still happens? Or maybe it's a conversation between the two of them. But anyways, the two characters. And then I'm happy it's in good hands.
Yeah, it's like, oh.
Okay, metatextuality for the win.
It's like too much. It's like that's when you know you're going down. It's like you have to say that in an episode. But other than that moment, I liked her character. I thought without Mulder there, it allowed her to be more like quirky and weird, and we could see her who she was like when she wasn't just obsessed with Mulder. And she's right in this case. Like, this is an X-File. There is something terrible going on here, and if it weren't for her, who knows what could happen to that kid. And I think her boyfriend, who I can't remember his name who shows up with the dead cat for Scully to dissect, gave something nice with Scully to work with too, the banter back and forth in that scene. We got a lot to see of old sarcastic Scully, and like I said, dissecting her cat on her kitchen table with like a cooking apron on and like gloves and like barbecue stuff, and she doesn't care, and she answers her phone with her bloody gloves on and everything, and it's great.
Yeah, there's a lot of the humor is very bold in this episode, particularly like the apron, for example. It has "something smells good" written on it, and it's very, very on the nose and clear, and which is fine. I'm not sure this is the right episode for it. When I watched it again, kind of going back to our previous discussion about Improbable, that was one issue I had, was the tone is fairly all over the map with the very lighthearted Agent Harrison thing. I thought it worked better in Alone than it did in this, where we're talking about a mother who basically stabbed herself a bunch of times, a cat that ate its own belly. You have Doggett threatening to burn a kid alive, hypothetically. It's not having... It's a lot of dark images combined with very, very goofy, very broad humor. Did the tone work okay for you, though?
I don't know. It worked better for me than it did in Improbable. I thought, because there are a lot of characters, a lot of FBI agents in this episode. We've got 5 to balance, and they each had their own little place to work with that I thought worked well. And you know what? I liked Doggett's, big threat at the end. I don't know, that's like maybe my babysitting style, which is why I don't have children. But I think it found, because it wasn't trying for that hyper real kind of tone that I think Improbable was going for, that
sure,
more absurdist quality. It wasn't aiming for that. It was aiming for like this more standard humor within a darker episode. So for me, I mean, it was uneven at parts, but I think it did work better if we're comparing it to Improbable.
Yeah, no arguments. I just thought the humor kind of reminded me more of like Bad Blood style, campy, as opposed to, let's say, Clyde Bruckman's. But it's not a fair comparison, so not at all. And it's fine. Everybody was perfectly charming, and I do agree that the guy who had the crush on Layla was a great match against Anderson with Scully. I thought that was a lot of fun. And I will, not to keep agreeing with you, but my favorite scene is the confrontation with Doggett and the fake gasoline at the end. I thought he nailed it, and I thought that scene really worked.
And I love what was it? Harrison says it at the end. It was like, Doggett, it's your lack of imagination that saved us. Which kind of like summed up his character. He really doesn't want to believe any of the stuff, and he's a non-believer. And I thought that it was very in line with her character, but it drew, it said something nice about his too. It's like, look, here's a nice fault of yours that helped save our lives, and I laughed at that line.
Going back to the issue about the special effects, about the CGI, I think one of the things that makes it a little more disappointing is the practical effects in this episode are really pretty good. They're pretty impressive. Like the punching of when he punches the sheriff with the blood, and some of the splatter, and the rest of the in the car, and the damage with all of that. All of that is pretty effective, and I think that contrast kind of hurts. What did you think about some of the deaths and the traditional X-Files scares and gore, the atmosphere? Do you think this works okay as a horror episode that is trying to be?
I think it could have taken that like psycho horror type thing. It goes into when like Doggett falls through that pit a little more. It's like all of a sudden, there are these pincer monsters, and there's one in Reyes' stomach, and you see the legs underneath her skin kind of popping. And then I thought it could do this like weird. We know the power's coming from the kid now. He could have done more with their setting. Like, they're in this house, and Doggett opens a door and falls into nothing, falls into a pit that wasn't there, which was really cool. And then the CGI monsters or whatever crawl all over him. But they could have done more like that. I guess the Christmas episode with...
the Ghost, It's Called Christmas.
Yeah.
It's phenomenal.
I mean, that does that so well, where they're playing with, like, the structure of the inside of the house. And they could have done something more with that. To, I think, build up the horror in that moment. Instead, everybody else kind of just gets in the car and is kind of waiting to leave.
when you were talking about the psych ward at the end with all the TVs. And again, this episode is very metatextual and overt when it's talking about the X-Files. He's watching these TVs, and then it's a way to stifle his imagination. It's said out loud. This is a TV show saying that. Okay. And I don't know if you caught this metatextual thing, and maybe it wasn't intentional or not, but there's a point where the boy is holding a drawing and hands it to Reyes and says, "I made this."
And so, yeah, to kind of reflect on the show, it could be. I mean, there's so much of that in this.
Just going back to the end where the Carter, the 1013.
Oh, yeah.
The little boy voice at the end of that. That's what I assumed it was. But it's like, if we're going to be commenting about the X-Files and throwing in jokes, let's go over the edge. But maybe I was looking too far into it.
Or maybe, I think maybe it was intentional. They could have just done more. If there was going to be like a meta episode, like with all that stuff at the end, go all out. And instead it's like they were really tentative about it and kind of just tried to sneak a few in.
For fans, it's always nice. Harrison references DPO and Doggett references Field Trip. And, that's cute. I mean, it's nice to know that the standalone episodes get their full shake in the weight of the X-Files story. Do you have anything else you want to talk about before we rate it?
I think that is all I have.
Oh, boy. Now comes the moment of truth. And what will you give Scary Monsters out of 10?
I'm going to give it a 5, and that's purely because of the scenes of Scully in her apartment with the guy bringing her the dead cat, the banter there, and the dissection of the cat later.
That's a fair reason. I am going to be a little grouchier and give it a 3.5. It probably deserves higher, but because it caused me to stay in the wilderness away from the X-Files, I got to be a little more harsh to it. And honestly, 2 of those points is, again, probably Doggett and Scully alone. I think they do a great job. And I think that Annabeth Gish can do a great job as Reyes, but in this episode, she's given almost nothing to do other than you're a victim and scream a little bit.
Yeah.
So that was unfortunate. But overall, it's not nearly as bad as I thought it was when I saw that 30-second clip so long ago. IMDb rated this episode 7.6, which is exactly the same as Improbable, which you talked about in the previous episode, 99 of the Podwatch. So take that for what you will. Let's move on to our second episode for today. So the second episode we're going to be talking about today is Jump the Shark, which originally aired April 21st in 2002. It is episode 15 of season 9. This is written by Vince Gilligan, John Scheiben, and Frank Spotnitz. It's directed by Cliff Bull. This episode features the ever-classic Lone Gunman, and it sort of acts as a wrap-up to their short-lived single-season TV series. Begins with Morris Fletcher, who we were first introduced to in the old Dreamland series of episodes prior. And he's out on a boat, eventually gets kidnapped, somehow gets mixed up with the Lone Gunman, find out that they're kind of on the way out, bankrupt, and have been looking for Eve, one of the main characters from their TV show, who is sort of an espionage expert. She's spotted murdering a college professor who has something missing from his inside, and it's glowing, phosphorescent. He worked and researched sharks and immunology. Okay, and then their old partner, Jimmy, from the TV series also shows up, and all of them are trying to work to track down Eve with Doggett and Reyes and Scully. And they eventually find out that there is a plot going on that is Eve's father is somehow involved with, where they're trying to have a bomb of sorts that is a biological something that's grafted inside someone's body and that at a certain point will be released and, in a sense, be biological warfare. And they have to find the guy at the right time and then disable the bomb. They eventually track down, with the help of another one of their hacker friends, it's Langley's rival, find out where Eve is at and stop her from killing this other individual who they think later was carrying the biological entity. They try to track him down, find out he wasn't carrying it, that he was a decoy. They figure out there's going to be a third person at a convention. They go trying to catch him before it's too late, and at the last minute, the lone gunmen find him and seal themselves in with him. Where it's released, they die. They're buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Everyone's there at the funeral except for Mulder, and I'm sure we'll talk about that, but even Skinner shows up. It is the end of the Lone Gunman, except for a small cameo ghost scene in The Truth, and then later in season 10, a very, 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 very short cameo in Babylon. I hope that wasn't too long of a summary there, Lauren, and I hope you're still awake.
I'm here.
What did you think about that episode?
The Lone Gunman deserved better. And it's not that I don't like that they die. I think narratively, having them sacrifice themselves like that, I think was a good narrative choice. I would have preferred, a better execution that felt less, like you said, the wrap-up episode for their spin-off series, and more, I guess, like an X-Files episode. Like, I remember being really struck when I first watched it, and like, oh my gosh, they're gonna die, they've been around forever, no! And then, but it just didn't have the emotional heft it could have. I mean, Scully's there talking at the grave, talking about how much these guys meant to her, but then she's barely in this episode at all. We don't get to see them interacting with Skinner or with Scully. It's with their spin-off characters from the spin-off show that most people probably don't remember. So it kind of loses the weight that it could have, which is, that's how I personally feel. I like their death, but I wish it was more of an X-Files episode and less a last spin-off episode.
Yeah, I can't argue that. I mean, they could have made it a two-parter and allowed it to kind of transition. This is very much a Lone Gunman toned episode, and transition from that into a more X-Files episode. I would say you've got a really good point, and one of the big issues is the absence of Mulder, considering that is our main connection to the Lone Gunman. I mean, it's sort of nice to have Scully around, but then, like you said, she's not really in this episode very much. And so you have two characters, Doggett and Reyes, who don't know them. And then, did you ever watch the Lone Gunman TV show?
I did, just that once when it aired. I have not rewatched it since, so I had to refresh my memory a little bit on some of who these people were.
Well, I'm assuming your opinion was not hyper favorable then of the show.
I mean, I remember I liked the idea that they were getting a spinoff, because I thought, oh, that's a cool thing. I really love these characters. And then, like, it was just okay, kind of the episodes. Like, I can see, I wasn't totally surprised or disappointed when it wasn't picked up for more episodes. But I think that's what hurts this episode in a rewatch that is, 15 years later now? I think when this one first aired, it was like 6 months or so after the spinoff ended. And so it was still fresh in people's minds, the people who had watched it and cared about it and liked these characters. So the connections there with Eve and Jimmy Bond, probably when this first aired, made more sense or had more impact. You watch it now, separate from that, and it's just kind of, Like, Who were these people? Why did they care so much about this Eve person? Why do they care that she might be a murderer now? Why does that Jimmy guy look so depressed? I don't understand. And I think you're right. I think a two-part might have worked better. Kind of like a one, like, Lone Gunman-ish half and one more of an X-Files half. And something you mentioned about, like, Mulder being absent, there's nothing they could do about that. David Duchovny was not going to come back for this episode. But they didn't even, like, talk about the absence of Mulder, which I thought was strange. Like, give me a scene with Scully and the Lone Gunman and make it feel like Mulder should be there and they feel that loss. So he's, like, there in spirit, but they don't even really mention him.
They could have even had Mulder leave a sign for them or a letter or something. They could have still had his character do something even if Duchovny wasn't around.
Right. Like, he managed to pass something on to Scully to put there. Or even it just magically appears, at the grave, and end on that shot instead of just the coffins.
And the main point I was trying to make is then just wait to kill them until you have Duchovny around.
Think about what, now that we have, I mean, at the time, I think they knew by this point that it wasn't getting a 10th series at that year. They didn't know, like, this whole TV resurgence and bringing back shows, rebooting trend was going to happen the way it is now. Like, if you would have left those guys alive. Think of what they could be doing in seasons 10 and 11 right now. Like,
Oh, yeah.
killing them off in a season 10 episode or a season 11 episode now that we're getting it. They could have done, like I said, so much more with that. And instead they were like, well, show's ending. Let's wrap these guys up, and let's wrap them up by killing them off.
Oh, the sadness. Yeah, one of the reasons I brought up the series, I haven't watched it for a long time, but from what I remember, the character of Morris Fletcher was only in the final episode or so. And then he was also in Dreamland, so I think, well, I can connect it to these two things. But I don't even think most X-Files fans would really like, oh, I remember this guy that important from both, and to think that's a good unifier. So that's kind of acting like the molder to connect the two. And they spend so much time with him, but he hasn't spent any time with any of our characters. The only person he spent any time with in the X-Files was Mulder, and the only person he spent time with was just a little bit with the lone gunman. And so Jimmy and Eve barely get any time spent with those three. So overall, the emotional weight was a little weakened.
I mean, and I love Michael McKean. Like, I'm a huge fan of the Clue movie.
And Spinal Tap, too.
Oh, yeah, and I, like, always love him, so I, like, love it, the fact that it's Michael McKean, but I'm watching it, and even I'm watching it, I'm like, oh, it's Michael McKean, it's not Morris Fletcher to me, because you're right, the character hasn't had, he does in those earlier episodes, but doesn't have much of a point here.
Oh, well, it's got some good things in it. What do you think specifically? I mean, let's go back to the moment of truth and the actual death, and did it, now rewatching, have any emotional weight for you at all, or just, how'd you feel about it?
I mean, it still did. I like I said, I really like the idea that these guys who are always, like, trying to uncover the truth and do things for the people are willing to really sacrifice themselves for people. It's one thing to say, write their articles and publish their newspaper trying to uncover the truth and save lives that way. It's another thing to actually put themselves on the line, and they do that. They live and die by their word. And I'm glad that we didn't see the death, like, see them succumbing to that virus. I think it was enough to see them standing there by that window. And even though I know, what the final shot is, I remember watching it the first time and thinking, oh, it's going to pull back and they're going to be, like, standing off to the side and, like, spying on their own funeral and they're still going to be alive. And it's not the case. And even watching it again, I still think, oh, it could still happen. And it still doesn't. And you miss them. Yeah,
definitely. I know that the X-Files comics, but it's kind of a hard thing to rewrite. I do agree. I really like that they did not show the death beyond that cutaway. They kind of leave a Star Trek II Wrath of Khan style goodbye scene.
Yeah.
There.
The one good thing they did do is that sounds rude. There's many good things they did, but they foreshadowed it throughout the episode in a nice way. It's kind of morose that the way they've kind of spent everything, they don't have it, they're bankrupt. So there's already a defeatist kind of attitude. So when they get there and they're very somber in their death, it feels tonally for the characters a little bit more natural. So I kind of bought into it, and I thought, that was considering all the other things they were up against, trying to balance all those characters and plot lines, I thought that part was the actual delivery and the goodbye they got was pretty effective.
Yeah, and you're right. You mentioned they foreshadowed the death, and they do that too. They say a lot of things like when they're smoking cigarettes, oh, those things will kill you. They talk about, if you die, I mean, you don't give in to the man, that, you're still alive, you still live after you're gone. Saving the world is like a young man's game. So there's lots of, like, worded references to death that crop up that kind of, you go back and you're like, oh.
Good point.
I think if they would have had, Scully at the window instead of that Eve and Jimmy, that would have made it mean more to me.
In my head, I always think of Scully being there, but the fact that she's not, that makes it so much a Lone Gunman TV show thing. And if they're trying to merge the two, going back to what we said, I agree, Scully should have been there. The good news is, we did get Skinner.
We did get Skinner. He pulled some strings.
Okay, now here's for the real moment of truth is, who's your favorite Lone Gunman?
I'm going to go with Byers, because he's the type of, you wouldn't think, like, he's the most buttoned up one. He's like the one that could have a normal life or a normal job and go back to that. And he's not, he's sticking with his guys. He's sticking to his beliefs, and he's rejecting that kind of normalcy that he could really have for himself as, to me, the most ordinary in that sense of the three.
Good choice. Good choice. It's tough to pick. They're all, I think the reason they worked is they're so complementary without being too caricature-ish, I think. I mean, Langley, to some degree, is written a little bit more of a caricature, but otherwise, and it's a shame that they killed him off in this way. Come on, writers.
Bring him back. You can always bring people back.
That's true. That is true. I mean, come on. For all we know that those were clones that died, and there's a bunch of others being grown somewhere in Ontario. Let's keep hope alive. Come on, Carter. Give us this one. Any final comments about Jump the Shark before we rate it?
No, I think I've given my eulogy for the lone gunmen here.
You don't want to say any more words? You sure?
Yeah, I think I'm...
Why don't you add your own eulogy to what Scully said? Rewrite it. What would you say if you're going to give your own eulogy for the lone gunman? What would you do?
Gone too soon. Hang on for 15 more years, because you're going to get another shot at a better death.
Okay, I'm going to recompose myself here, get grounded. Okay, what would you give this episode out of 10?
I'm going to have to go down there and, a 4. Give it a 4.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm not... It was the right death for them, but too much spin-off and not enough cohesion with the X-Files.
Okay, now, taking it away, I hate to be a jerk, taking it out, imagine it was not an X-Files episode. Just the humor in general.
Okay.
And the plot, what would you rate it? Would that change your rating at all?
Might bump it up to maybe a 6 there for that. As like a wrap up. I think it's still rushed too much they wanted to squeeze in too much of Eve's background that they clearly had bigger plans for.
Yes.
So, but if it wasn't supposed to be in an X-Files episode, I would give it a 6. Okay,
good. Well, I just was curious how much of those two there. It's totally fair. I'm actually going to be a little more friendly and generous and give it a 5.5. I found that I agree with all the points about it being too crammed, too packed full. Not the right episode to kill them off, but as you did say, it is a good death for them. And I think the way that was done, the Andy and the Arlington, that's very well done. I think that some of the humor and the rapport and interplay between the lone gunmen is done really well. I enjoy them. I enjoy watching them in that context. There's enough in here to enjoy that I've got to give it a little bit higher than I normally would, even though as a whole piece it's flawed, but there are a lot of nice moments in there.
Fair enough.
Okay, I hope we can still be friends after this.
We can. I don't hold grudges too much.
Too much. Okay, jeez. Now I'm getting on edge. So thanks so much for talking about these 2 episodes, Lauren.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks, Tony, for having us both. Thanks, Tony. And you can follow the Xcast on Twitter at @the_cast, or come visit our Facebook page and group, so the Xcast X-Files podcast fan group. This is an active group, and considering this was recorded in June, I can't imagine how much great content's happening in December. So up next on the Xcast Podwatch is going to be Podwatch episode 101, and they're going to be talking about the 2 episodes, William and Release. We've got a lot of mythology meat in there for you listeners to just dig into, digest, reflect, have a lot of fun.
Until next time, trust no one.